Okay. Hello and welcome to another cover seminar, this time jointly with the Center for Curating. And for this week's event, we have something quite special. We're going to have a chat and a presentation with Juliana Lim, who I first came across your work, Juliana, in 2016. And I was quite impressed learning about how the role you had had in sort of developing an independent art scene in Singapore, and how you kind of almost sort of like backed into devising some interesting plans as you're working for the government ministry then. And I thought that was super interesting, and so I think it's interesting to sort of let's say provide space and time for people who to tell the stories that haven't gotten told so far, and it's quite an interesting story. So, I thought that's why we invited you along to talk about your newly released book, which is quite nice. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. I want to thank Stephen and the University of Essex Center for Curating for inviting me to do this Zoom session. I'm going to start now. So my first slide is for those who are not in Singapore. I thought it'd be good to let you know where we are at the bottom end of Southeast Asia between Malaysia and Indonesia. And we were originally a British colony, of course, right? But now we're an independent Republic of Singapore. And we are very proud to be very multicultural, okay? Okay, now, this slide tells you about, it tells you that the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, MISI, is the ministry in charge of arts and culture development, okay? And here's their vision and their mission right here. These wordings are different, but I think through all of 20 or 30 years or 40 years, the same intent is still consistent, that culture is a way to enlarge the personalities of Singaporean, as well as a way to build social cohesion and a resilient society. Okay, so the words are different, but it's the same in meaning. And the specific statutory board looking after arts development is the National Arts Council. Okay, so when I place this information into a chart like that, you will realize that MISI is the latest of the ministries involved with arts development. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is changed 5 times in nomenclature over half a century, actually, literally. And what's interesting is that the arts portfolio bounces between, in some time, in Ministry of Culture and MITA, it is coupled with government information dissemination. But in the other 3 cases, it's coupled with social welfare and community development and sports, okay? So in a way, we've never had a full arts ministry, which I think in itself is a statement in itself, okay? Right, and so overlapping this chart then with my own career, I served in the People's Association, I served in the Ministry of Culture, I served in MCD, I served in MITA, I served in the Singapore Arts Centre Company, and after I left, the name changed twice over. Okay, so that tells you the overall perspective of where I come in, okay? And essentially, I am a 20th century arts manager. It sets me in a particular time frame, right? And I must have a disclaimer that it's not the official arts management history. It's just my story and what I know, okay? And what I'm going to do is now to take you through I'm going to skim through 3 of my jobs, right? Before I focus on what I think to be the most important of my jobs. So my first job in the arts was in a place called the People's Association. This is a statutory board with nearly 200 community centers all around Singapore. It functions as the government's network for communicating its policies. It's also a way for government to gather feedback on our populace, okay? But in the course of doing these rather political activities, there was also a very strong, still is now, a very strong emphasis on enriching the lives of people in the heartland. Okay. And so my one wonderful job there was to organize cultural programs for the community. Sorry, I'm this one here, okay? And it included organizing the Chingay Festival is a street festival which was introduced in the 1960s when Singapore banned the use of firecrackers during the Lunar New Year. This parade was introduced to enliven the Chinese New Year period, right? And this parade still exists, and today is very high profile, become an international tourism attraction, okay? And I also ran a cultural troupe comprising full-time musicians, dramatists, Chinese instruments, military band. The troupe went around Singapore, staging concerts, what we call road shows, right, for the enjoyment of the Heartlanders. Okay. So after 3 years in this job, I moved on into the mainstream, the Ministry of Culture. And this was a promotion because this is the Ministry of Culture, right? The other one is the Stat Board, which is one level lower in terms of hierarchy. And in this ministry, I had a wonderful job of organizing music and visual arts events at a more national level. So I organized like festivals of choir, festivals of instrumental music, jazz festival, Singapore Arts Festival. I organized corporate art competitions. I published the first ever coffee table book on Singapore artists. And I published a book on the Singapore's national anthem composer. After 3 years there, or 3 years there, actually, I moved on. But I'm going to interrupt that story for now and talk about my dream job, right? In 1993, I was invited to head the company to develop our performing arts center, a world-class performing arts center called the Esplanade Theatre. And this building comprises of, this is designed the style of, Sydney Opera House and a multi-oratorial art center, which has got a very good acoustical concert hall designed by this American acoustician called Russell Johnson. And I really believe we've got the best in the world because the hall is fully tunable. It's got reverb chambers, right? And so this was a dream job, working with world-class architect James Sterling, the James Sterling Company from England, Russ Johnson, theatre designers from England, to produce this wonderful center, which is I would say the pinnacle of our arts scene in Singapore, right? Yeah. So these were my three jobs, okay? But the one I want to dwell on most is this one here, okay? Right. It's the job somewhere in between, okay? Now this job was important because that's where I was able to develop the ecosystem for arts companies. Now, how did it happen? End December 84, I was actually on leave when the newspapers announced a cultural vision 1999, okay? Obviously, my bosses had been working on it, but I didn't know anything about it. Now, this was such a bold vision to create a culturally vibrant Singapore. You can read there, let me see, it says there, a city of excellence, a society of distinction, a cultivated society, a knowledgeable, well-read society, a society well, this manifesto was really from the ruling party. It was announced when we were ushering in the regime, well, the tenure of our second Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, okay? And this was such an important announcement that for me as a struggling arts manager, it gave me a lot of motivation to do more. I basically felt unshackled, and I went to my boss and said, can I give up my music and visual arts programming and start this thing called the cultural services section? Because until then, we were only concerned with programming, with creating, events around the year. But I felt that events are ephemeral in nature, I've got to go back of house, right, to address the more fundamental problems faced by artists. I had by then met artists who said, I've come back from England. There I can get studios. Are there studios here? I'm told I'm sorry, there are no studios here. So I went to my boss, and he agreed. I set up this section here, and this section was my vehicle for developing this ecosystem. Okay, so what did we do exactly? Now, at the time, the only form of support for arts groups was the project grant. Okay, that means that a group comes to us and say, I want to apply for a grant to organize an event. They get a grant and they come back again and again and again, maybe 4 times a year. And I say, this is no good because you're living from hand to mouth, right? So essentially, I had a role in mooting an annual grant, which means that you come to us 3 or 4 months. Sorry? Somebody, can you please turn off your, you can just turn off your speaker. Yeah. Hi, Mabel. Hi, yeah. If you can turn off your speaker. Thank you. Yeah. So I thought, can you apply for a grant 3 to 6 months ahead of the year, and we'll give you an annual grant, a bigger chunk of money, which will take you through the whole year, right? Then you can with that chunk of money plan your program more confidently, right? And so we launched this thing, and I faced 2 issues with the first round of the annual grants. First, societies told me, Juliana, Mrs. Chua at the time, I cannot produce next year's program because there's an annual general meeting for a society and I may be voted out. So I cannot give you a 9 to 12 months program, okay? Whereupon I then took on, I then became, I'm not sure where my courage came from, right? Yeah. I told them all to convert from societies into companies. I said, go and reconstitute yourself as a company. Because as a company, you've got 2 or 3 founders, right? And these people are there year in, year out. There may be boards, but the boards are more stable than for a society, right? So all of them are now arts companies, okay? And if there's a thing called a non-profit arts company where the founders and the shareholders don't earn any dividends, all monies earned by the company are plowed back into the company. Okay, so we all serve voluntarily, right? So the first thing was to make them change their legal status, right? The second was that I had to tweak my annual grants eligibility criteria because on your official documents, right, it's still read only societies are eligible, right? You've got to change that rule too. So that kind of that went in parallel with the when the groups converted into companies, we changed the rules and they could therefore apply. Okay. There's one more problem I faced that first round. We finally chose about 13 companies. And then I think my boss got cold feet because when you give more money to a few groups, right, you become less popular. All the ones that didn't get that bigger sum will be unhappy, right? And there was at least one society, one company that went to a member of parliament and a minister to try and lobby against our decision. So consequently, that first year, the chunk of money was not as large as we hoped. And it became a bit of a joke because when people went back to applying for project grants, they sometimes got more money from, say, 3 project grants than from 1 annual grant. So it backfired in a sense, right? But the following year, I think we all got used to the idea. And today, I think the Arts Council has got lots of grants of very large sums of money for companies. There's no more fear about companies feeling unhappy about inequality of treatment, because truth of the matter is that there are stronger and weaker companies. Okay. The third thing was arts housing scheme, right? Okay. So, apart from the project grants that we gave to the arts organizations, there was no other form of support, right? Yeah. And I had learned by then that there were companies that needed space to work in. So, where is it now? Oh, that's the annual grant paper, by the way, a very old document, right? Okay, and the first year we gave them, what, I can't remember, I can't see here, 9 grants the first year worth $51,000, right? Okay, so this arts housing scheme, right? So we did surveys in 2 years, and we found that the groups were mostly what I call nomadic in nature, right? The rehearsals were held at home. They were held in drama centers, practice rooms. They were held in school halls. They were held in community centers, wherever the groups could find space, right? And I realized, therefore, that this was a very weak link in the capacity to produce events, right? So what I did was this. Every year, every quarter of the year, the government, the land office, circulated a list of disused government buildings, okay? These were mostly schools, because the schools were then encouraged to move into the heartland. And all these schools, like the one here in this picture, 4 stories high, fell vacant. And these buildings were mainly used by charity organization, boys' home, girls' home, right? And it struck me one day that our arts groups could use these buildings, right? So I invited someone from a land office to my office. I said, can we just talk about this? I really do need buildings for the arts. And from that day onwards, that man became my best ally. He would say, Juliana, he'll call me, Juliana, do you want this building or that building or that building, And these buildings were sometimes offered to me for only 3 years. They said, we're going to road widen in maybe 3 years. Do you or don't you want it? And we just took it, okay? So the first building here, Teluk Ayer Performing Arts Center, it's a 4-story building in the heart of the Central District, became vacant in November 1985, I think, and 8 groups moved in 86 January, okay? And, there were no acoustical treatment for the rooms. There were Chinese opera groups, there were Malay drama groups, there was a musicals, a theater group, and they all just moved in very happily. Now they had offices, they had storage space, they had rehearsal space. And by the end of the first year, they all told me their output tripled, okay? Because they had space to rehearse as and when they wanted it, their very own space. Sorry? Someone say anything? Okay. So from after this first building, I took another building called Cane Hill Arts Center. It was empty for quite a number of years. It housed the Anglo-Chinese school in the 1970s, I think, or even earlier. It was vacant. And when I walked in with my staff, there were signs of drug taking and broken glass. It felt very haunted, but we took it anyway, right? Yeah. And then there's this building on Fort Canning. Stamford Road. This was a Japanese school, a very beautiful, colonial building. This one here has, the first building stood 35 years. The second is still standing. The third one is still standing, was recently refurbished into a traditional art center. And of course, the most famous is a substation. This was a substation that was closed, was about 10, 15 years vacant. And it was it looked very unsuitable, It was very, very unfriendly, like fortress-like. But I climbed into it by a side, a vertical metal ladder, slid the door open, and I found that, oops, what is this build? What's this? This room? It's got holes in the floor. It was a generator room. And this became our first independent art Center, run by a very prominent dramatist called Guo Baokun. He was, we had three bids for the building, and he won the bid. And I think we loved the idea because it was multicultural, multidisciplinary, and at the time we were kind of like craving for a center comparable to the Hong Kong Art Center. I think it's now closed. I think it was a fringe club, so vibrant, like a hangout space for artists, and Pao Kun, of course, has ran it for until he died. I think 6 years later. It changed. There were 2 or 3 other artistic directors, but the building has now been taken back by the Arts Council after the 25 years and being restored for another kind of use, right? Yeah. So and on the right, a substation garden. It had a garden. This garden belonged to a neighboring school, and Pao Kun said he wanted some nature, and even fought for the banyan tree to be retained. And in this garden, there were weekend flea markets. There were outdoor performances. Just a wonderful, wonderful space that became, when the substation closed, or rather the building was taken back, the groundswell from the artists was enormous, And I tell myself, wow, could never have imagined that, right? That this building, we took it we took it without any much hope about what's going to happen. But then, it became an icon of independent arts thinking, right? Yeah. Then these are 2 other, never mind, I'll go on. Okay, this one here. This is Fort Canning Arts Center. A British, it was military barracks, actually. Military barracks, right? And this, in fact, I faced a little problem there. After I committed it to the dance theatre and theatre works, right? Our Parks Board took over the building, and they tried to persuade me to rescind my offers to the dance group and the theatre group. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't, because, they said either you charge them a higher rental or you withdraw the offer. I just stood firm and said, I'm sorry, I can't do this, right? And I remember the Parks Board CEO was so upset with me. He flew into a rage and just ranted at me. And I was just too shocked to react. And finally he said, you're a very, very strong woman. Another woman would have cried, right? And I said, I had a very clean conscience, And so this building stood for about, about 25 years as well, before it was taken back for a Fort Canning building. Okay. What else? Oh, the next scheme I introduced, which is not here, it's a theatre residency scheme. And this one here was, basically, so the groups have got annual grant, they've got their housing, right? The next thing is theatre space, right? There were about 4 theatres in existence. And I knew of the concept of theatre residency from England, of course, right? The Barbican houses the London Phil, right? London Symphony, I think, yeah. National Theatre had its own building at a time, and so on and so forth, right? But we had very few theatres, and we could not give every group their own theatre, okay? So this scheme allows 3 groups to share a theatre. So we match the theatre to the groups based on the art form. Like Victoria Theatre was given to 3 groups, right? And each group had 4 seasons a year, free, okay? They had 3 days for performances, a day for bump in, a day for bump out, 4 times a year. And they could add on days at the usual rental rates if they wished. And my theatre staff were encouraged to assist them with clerical duties. So about when they launched it, the groups were very happy, and is there a press cutting? I'm not sure. There's a press cutting here. Oh, there we are. So you can see here, we launched the scheme, and at the beginning, the groups were, again, the usual thing happened. The groups that didn't qualify ran to the ministers to complain against the scheme. And there again, I've got to go explain, because my boss will say, you go explain, right? I've got to fend off the minister's objections. And we got our way, because I think we were steadfast in our criteria. steadfast with steadfast in being fair, right? Yeah. And so this group ran for about this scheme. Uh, uh, it was judged to be a funding scheme that works. Okay, and I tell you why I did this, because there are 30 days in a year, right? The groups were were booking uh, uh dates on a very ad hoc basis. So consequentially, you lost about 10 days a month actually. And they couldn't book ahead uh because they but now they had annual grant, they could in fact plan their programs ahead. So this scheme allows them to book the space for the next for the following year. Okay, so in a way, it eased all their organizational problems, right? And so I had this rationale, right? I give you grants, you pay for my rentals. Why don't I give you less grants and not charge you rental? In which case, we both save work, right? But you still have the theater space, right? So I think on that grounds, I think the scheme worked, right? But I think the Arts Council subsequently disbanded the scheme. But this idea of full accounting, the accountants always have their day. They thought, well, we should account for everything, every line of accounting, and so they could not accept gratis items given for gratis. And so the scheme has disbanded, and the Arts Council has gone back to giving grants to pay for rentals. Okay. The next scheme I introduced was our first arts administration course. I was totally untrained. I'm a sociologist I got a degree in sociology from my first degree. None of my staff were trained. We all were, a few of us were musically trained, but by and large, all of us were just amateurs, right? And this was the first ever arts admin course. And we organized a 3-week course, daytime for the staff, nighttime for the arts companies. And here you see my arts admin certificate, the only qualification I have. Okay. Right. So okay. Okay. I also started a arts database. At the time, we never even thought of monitoring, right, our progress, right? And I realized that from that we have to monitor our progress by for example, finding out who goes to the theater, who likes drama, who likes music, right? How often do you go, right? So between me and my staff, we stood in the theater foyer every night during the drama festival and dispensed all the forms, right? And got our first cycle of audience surveys, right? And you find all this findings here, which I you can read it for yourself, right? Yeah. And of course, the press reported on our findings. 12,000 theater goers being polled. There were questions like, where are the men? Where the women go more often? They go on weekends. Yeah, and drama was more popular, right? Yeah. Okay, so that was a very, very, very rudimentary. There were no computers then. Of course, everything was done manually, right? And I had some cynical colleagues who said, why do you bother? Because we only have a handful of compositions. And I said, if you don't start, you will not be able to, you'll not be able to catch up thereafter. Okay. Okay, so then towards the end of my stay in that ministry, we developed the first ever arts blueprint in Singapore. 1988, the Advisory Council of Culture and the Arts, chaired by no less than Mr. Ong Teng Cheong, who became our first elected president. He chaired this committee. I was assistant secretary, and we had a very, we had many meetings with many experts as well as members of the public, and this was then published, right? Yeah, and this was the report, right, that gave rise to the formation of the National Arts Council, National Heritage Board, and Singapore Arts Centre Company. But before that, it was all done by the ministry, okay? And the National Museum was just one museum in itself, right? And this report also legitimized sort of gave legitimacy to all the things we've been doing, arts housing, it all is all in this report. Okay. So that describes my work. Okay. What I should now do is go back upstream now and say that thanks to my successes in the ministry, we have since then had 5 other blueprints, right? There was Renaissance City plans 1, 2, and 3. There was the SG plan, arts plan, 2 SG art plan, and they're proposing a $100 million investment from last year to 2027. Okay, and so this is documentation about this arts plan. Okay, something is okay. So the Ministry of Community Development's annual report sort of summarizes what I just said, right? A new division was formed, right? Yeah, organized arts administration, did research, right? And basically we did more. And then at the end of the year, they said we increased number of activities from 996 to about 1586, right? Okay, and you know what? Since then, thanks to my successes, look at the growth in our art scene. 2007, $1.5 million, 1.5 million people went to arts events, right? Indoor and outdoor, right? The numbers have just grown thanks to my successes. And this is just a bit of a memento, right? That we have to show that within the ministry, we spend so much and achieve so much, right? Yeah. So this is about it, really, about my job, right? But I want to add on a point about what I call arts evangelism, right? Yeah. So today there are arts colleges like Joyce's College, NAFA, running arts administration courses, right? And there are hundreds of students running these courses, right? Going to these courses, and I know that there won't be enough jobs for them in the arts sector. So I've been telling them that, that if you can't find a job in the arts sector, go join a corporate organization, right? Because after I left the arts sector, I went to Singapore Pools, which is a lottery company. And because my boss was very trusting of me, gave me room to engage artist friends to do our calendars, to do our trade shows, yeah. And basically I brought all my arts contacts into my lottery organization. I think every arts manager, if they went into an Apple or any company at all, because all companies need their brochures, they need their year-end dinner and dance, they need their trade, what they need to have their promotional road shows, right? The arts manager in there can bring in artists to do all these jobs to a higher standard than somebody else. Okay, so this is my battle cry today, arts evangelism. Okay, I think I should stop here. Okay, I should stop here. All right, yeah. Thank you for listening to me, and I will answer questions, or we can talk about what I've just shared. Thank you, Stephen.
Oh, thank you for that. That was super interesting. And a nice whirlwind tour of 30 or 40 years of things you've been working on. So I have things to ask, but I will hold off for a second and see if other folks have things you want to ask about before I do that.
I have a question.
Go for it.
One thing about people in the creative sector, whether they are artists, they're musicians, they're performers, they have to make a living. You don't want them you want them to have a day job. I mean, you don't want them to have a day job and then part-time, because they can't support themselves with their talent and their creativity, that they have to go and work elsewhere so that they can continue, and even maybe not, because life goes on. If they cannot support themselves, then they would have to give up their artistic talent. So what are the things that you've done to make sure that they can make a living, a good living, doing what they love and what they have been gifted?
Okay, so I've got to confess this, Bileng, that there is no solution in the art sector. So, maybe Joyce can jump in later on. See, a lot of artist friends, whether they're singers or visual artists, right? They make their living by teaching. Okay? Because there just aren't enough events in a year. Let's say if you're an opera singer and you sing 4 or 5 times a year, those 4 or 5 events will not give you a living. You've got to make a living by teaching, okay, by producing as well, okay, and doing jobs that are linked to arts, right? Yeah. But I have come to a conclusion that I would have no problems with, okay, go again. I used to think that being professional means being full-time in the arts. I now have come to the conclusion that no, I don't agree with that. I prefer an artist to find a job somewhere else, not necessarily in the arts, that keeps them alive, okay? So they don't compromise their art. Because I've seen visual artists compromise on their art because they couldn't find any other way of living. But I've met people like doctors, lawyers, framers, right, who make a living out of those professions, but can still compose to a very professional standard. So I would say that if you can find a job in the arts doing linked activities, please go ahead. If you can't, please don't feel embarrassed about looking for jobs outside the arts that keeps you together, okay? So you can do your arts to a very high standard with high integrity. That's what I've come to realize at this age now. Okay, right. What do the others think? Joyce, what do you think, Joyce? Yeah.
If I could jump on that, it's interesting because one of the projects that I just finished up was interviewing a number of artists and cultural workers who were trying to find ways to balance off their sort of livelihoods as an artist with their sort of survival more generally. And one of the things that I tend to find is, in terms of balancing careers, that people who had second jobs that were actually closer to the arts felt more frustrated by that because the work felt like it was close to what they wanted to do, but not really. So when they would have a second job as sort of like, as a waiter or something that was completely unrelated, somehow that didn't cause as much psychological strain. So I think there's different ways of balancing off or trying to balance off, like, livelihoods and what you actually want to do. And yeah, I don't know if it's an easy answer, but yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, Joy.
so maybe I can jump in here. I think that there are a couple of issues here. The first one is, as you mentioned, how do you become a professional artist? I mean, the concept of a professional artist means to some people is that your profession is an artist, right? And then some people do arts on the side. To some extent, I believe we can actually do two things. We can practice our art, our passion, and at the same time have a day job. But I feel that just like, when you want to become an Olympic champion, I always use Joseph Schooling as an example. You really need to devote yourself 100% to your art so that you can excel in it. Of course, the question is always, how do we make that sustainable? And nowadays, there are some young Singaporean artists who are very entrepreneurial. They start their own arts company and they focus on their art. And I suppose that's where the arts management graduates come in. They hire arts management graduates to do the admin part. And from there, the artistic director and the artist can concentrate on excelling in their art form. So just my thought at the moment. I might come up with other ideas later on.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Juliana,
Yeah. Stop sharing, right?
sorry. Yeah.
Do I stop sharing? How do I?
Yeah, a
how do I
couple of
stop?
things reacting
Oh, dear.
to. Sorry,
Oh dear. I think
somebody
I've
else
lost.
wants to go ahead.
Is my sharing gone? It's gone, right?
Yeah, your
I got-
sharing is
okay.
done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, hi, Victor.
Yeah, Khan, why don't you go
So sorry,
ahead?
Khan. Go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
That's fine. I'm patient. I may be patient, but can I remember what I want to say? Oh, Joyce, thanks for your thoughts. One thing I like to pick up is that you compare with schooling. Artists and professional artists with schooling, quite different comparison, because schooling was trained to beat everybody else and become first. To be a professional artist, you're not training for that. So it's slightly different sort of comparison. Now, the other thing too, Juliana, is that, oh no, I think, who was it? I think it's Billing.
Billing.
Oh, well, somebody say something about professional, what is professional artist? I think one problem artists face in Singapore is the size of Singapore
Mm.
and the size of population. If you are an artist in London, for example, or in
China.
yeah, or well, yeah, in a country that's larger and with much bigger population, you may be able to, not talking about the top artists, if you are a reasonably good artist, you may be able to live on that art and therefore be a professional. But Singapore is a small country and it's a small population. And as with every other population, the percentage of people that support art is not a big number. So yeah, does that answer your question that the size of Singapore makes it difficult to be a professional artist? I don't know if you agree. What do you think, Juliana?
Yeah. I think you're right there. I mean, but even I want to qualify. I want to just make another comment, right? So difference between the artists who are in a corps, like corps ballet, an orchestra where the music is dance is made with a lot of people, right? They tend to have full-time careers because companies would pay for their salaries to rehearse day in, day out, right? Yeah. But the other kind of artists are the independent artists, and they're the ones who face a great difficulty. I would say that even for like opera singers, right? Unless you're published, unless you're published, it's very hard to make a living. The majority of them cannot live based on just the number of performances here, and they tend to teach as well. Unless you're Lang Lang or Yu Jiang Wang, and they're all over marketed, right? Yeah. But I think that I would still say that that if you're an independent artist, you've got to find other ways of nurturing, supporting yourself to protect your art. I would say, to protect in the sense that you've got integrity in what you do. You don't have to compromise on your subject matter or your standard, or produce like a factory. But I've seen really top class artists reproduce their works because that's the only way they make a living. Top class artists, they repeat themselves, because they have to keep on selling. They find a sweet spot and reproduce the same again and again and again. Yeah. So yeah.
I'm just curious if I can sort of rope in Gavin on this, because I'm curious about, in your experience, Gavin, of teaching both art history students and curating students who want to go into having these kind of careers in the present. Are we talking about the same conditions that they're dealing with now? And what do you tell to young artists who are sort of wrestling with these kind of tensions, and young curators?
Yeah, I think a lot of the problems are very similar, like to the problems that you're describing artists facing now. That the role of a curator or arts administration courses, which is also what I'm teaching now, has become heavily professionalized. That the universities produce lots of courses in these things, so people are doing degrees in curation or in arts administration. And you have to say to them that there are not that many, for all the students around, even just in, say, the UK that are taking these courses at each university, far outnumbering the number of jobs that are available. One of the consequences is that the jobs start to demand that professionalization. So a lot of curators in the UK now have PhDs, which really isn't necessary professionally for a lot of them, but it's it's become this process of professionalization, which obviously has an exclusive effect. And that is something a lot of that I was going to ask you about. I mean, reading the book and really enjoying it. And one of the things that my students do ask me about a lot, I really enjoyed how you talk about some of the conflicts and difficulties that you faced. And that's always what my students want to ask about. So for example, like you talk about, and I don't know, I know Stephen's recording the session, so if you can't talk about some of it, I understand. But you talk about some moments where, for example, you were like there was some tension around you, some of your co-workers regarding you possibly as like being anti-Chinese, or also moments where the tension around issues of multiculturalism. But also something that most of the students I have are mostly women, and so they're very concerned about their role as women working in the arts and in workplaces generally. And I wondered if that's something that you could speak about, because obviously you're working, in the 70s and the 80s and 90s in Singapore, and what your experience of working in culture as a woman was then, and like did you face particular difficulties then?
No, on the contrary, there's never been gender issue in Singapore. There were more women in the arts than there were men, in fact, in the ministry. So that was never an issue, yeah. This issue with being Chinese is ironic, because I was raised by very, very Anglophile parents. My father was a La Salle brother before he got married to my mother, and my mother was French convent trained, right? So I grew up with very little Chinese culture and even Chinese language, right? And that's why this issue with the green hats, can you imagine that? I was trying to produce all these green visors to protect my staff from they were going to they were doing all the crowd management for the parade, right? I made all these green visors, and of course a green hat means a man's been cuckolded. And I never knew that, right? And in the end, they all refused to wear it, of course, right? Yeah. So and they all thought I was wow, I'm so un-Chinese, right? That was my first experience, of course, right? The second was trying to rebalance the visual arts committee, was operating in Mandarin, and I added on Malay artists and English-speaking artists and curators and art teachers, and I was accused of being anti-Chinese because we then began to operate in English, right? So yeah, I mean, as a Chinese, imagine that I can't believe that I actually faced those problems. How ironic that it's my own peoples, right, accusing me of that. Yeah, yeah. But I have to admit that I was very, very Anglophile until I went to the Guillemets Museum in 1993, the Guillemets Museum in Paris, right? And I was so totally ashamed that this Frenchman knew so much about ceramics that I knew nothing about. And then I really read up furiously about ceramics and Chinese civilizations and so on. And although I can't speak too much Mandarin, but I know a bit more about the dynasties and so on. Yeah, yeah. But there's a man here, Victor Yu. Victor, are you there, Victor? Victor, who's a Taoist expert and our Chinatown expert. Hi,
I'm here.
Victor. Hi,
Hi.
Victor. Hi. I was telling him how un-Chinese I am. You're the man who trades Chinatown every day, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but my command of Chinese is also no good.
Really? Okay. Ironically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I want to take this discussion about arts and the economy a bit more, right? Yeah. So apart from the individual, what about arts companies, right? It took me a long time to realize that arts companies must also do non-arts things to survive, right? For example, merchandising, right? How the musicals companies like Cameron Macintosh, they all survive by making merchandise. At one time, we sort of thought of this as being we're very dismissive about all these things or doing all this commercial stuff, right? But then today I realized, oh my, that's the only way to survive, you know, to protect the productions. You got to do the non-production stuff, right? The outreach programs and merchandising to survive, you
Okay.
see. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think there's also other interesting ways which artists can work together. I mean, for instance, Gavin and I are both friends with people from a cooperative in the US called Just Seeds, and they're mainly printmakers. But what they
Uh-huh.
do is they formed a cooperative to help with the distribution and sales of their prints, such that a lot of that sort of more administrative work, which would be really onerous if you're doing it artist by artist, can be sort of collectivized in a way that helps the overall cooperative.
Mm.
Mhm.
Right,
I'm
yes,
sure,
yeah.
I'm sure Gavin
Juliana,
knows other examples of similar things as well.
Yeah, yes, Khan, yes, yeah.
I'd like to add to what you just say about that to be a artist, you do have to do something else, even for art company, because I think in the last 10 years, just pulling off the top of my head, in the last number of years, many opera companies, many symphony orchestra were struggling financially. And they really dependent on government funding and very rich sponsor funding
Mm.
to survive. So
Mm.
I don't think any of these big symphony orchestra and opera houses, I don't think they can survive just by being professional and living on their art
Mm. Right,
without
yeah.
funding.
Yes, yeah. And this is true in
Or
America too.
living on
It's true in America too. The
or
American,
living on. Sorry, go ahead,
sorry,
Juliana. Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I was just saying that in America, you know how the different arts funding policies, right? In Europe, you know, the companies are nearly 80% funded, right? Whereas in America, it's like 50-40. In Singapore, it's like 30-30-30. I'm not sure about now, but it was like 30% funding, 30% from ticket sales, 30% from corporate sponsors. So there are different what I call styles of arts funding around the world. But apart from Europe, I think, and even then, I think it's fading as well. Or even England, right? Yeah, you've got to find other ways to make a living to survive. Yeah, survive. Yeah. Jerry, you still there, Jerry?
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about on a heritage viewpoint?
No, I mean, I think it was very interesting to find out a little bit more about the background to all these things. A lot of the terms that you've mentioned, I've seen in like archival emails when I draw them out. Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of I guess in some ways the heritage industry is a little bit trying to play catch up in a sense, because we are also trying to sort of scope out who are the stakeholders in our ecosystem. Ours, I don't know whether it's as straightforward as the arts where you can bucket them into like different performing art types, visual arts and all that. But for heritage work, what we are finding now is that our work is increasingly complex because we actually have a lot more community groups that are invested in heritage. People like Victor who also, you know, step up and do things, and how as a government agency we can then support and help these different companies, these different individuals. I think that's something that we're also trying to think through, which it's not easy answer. Yeah. So I don't know.
Right. Never enough money, right? Never enough money.
I think Gavin's gonna have to leave in a second, but maybe one other thing I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, is one of the things I'm struck by in your book and also by in your presentation is you talk a bit about how Singapore never really gets a fully developed cultural ministry or an artistic ministry. But one thing that seems is it almost seems like in the earlier phase in the 80s, when cultural policy wasn't as well developed, you almost seem to have more of a kind of zone of freedom to do things because no one was paying attention as much. So you
Yep.
could just do things and set up art spaces with your ally who was saying, here's a building, here's a building. And it
Yeah,
almost
right,
seems
yeah.
almost like the formalization of cultural policy has actually made things more difficult.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
my question is then, what things could we learn today from this earlier, more informal period of planning
Mm,
and organizing that would be important for cultural planners, arts
mm,
administrators to think through today,
yeah,
now that things are more professionalized?
yeah. See, I'm not sure you can reproduce the conditions of that time, you know. I think Jerry and Joyce can probably help me with this one here. At that time, you know, arts and culture was very low priority. Okay, very low priority. Um, the budget was very low, very small. Not only that, the staffing was very limited. Okay, and I would say that in a way it became a dumping ground for sort of people who dropped out of other more important services, right? Yeah, and I can only say that I chose to be there. I was invited to go to Ministry of Finance, and I said no, I love this job, and I actually chose to stay there. But there were people who came in because they couldn't find a job somewhere else, right? Yeah. So because it was such low priority, our higher ups had more important interests, more important priorities. And I always say the gift to me and my staff at the time was that the lack of interest gave us this space to play, right? So I was, for me, it was like I'm paid a salary, I got to solve the problem, right? I mean, there's no heroism, there's no saintliness. I'm paid a salary. The artist's problems are my problems, and I must find ways to solve it. And my boss, of course, you know, they're relying on us to produce the answers, right? And because they trusted us, I think I was lucky to be trusted. I could then stretch my arms out and to people in various parts of the service and find my own allies. And I think I was very conscious that I don't get my boss in trouble. For example, the arts housing scheme, right? I never wrote a paper about it, you know. I didn't say I want to have 10 buildings for the arts to provide so many square feet of space for so many artists. I simply took one building at a time, right? I took one building at a time. And then when I got the building, I went for approval to allow these 8 groups into it, to charge this price or that price, right? And then when it was settled, I went on to the next building, right? Yeah. But you know, since those days, these buildings have become more premium. Suddenly, the government realized that these buildings are very charming, very quaint, right? And they're now being given to restaurants, being given to design houses, fashion houses, right? So we can't replace a time when these buildings they were just, what do I do with them? The land office, the man who was working with me had 30, 40 buildings every quarter, you know, to find a use for. So basically there's no similar situation today where buildings are unwanted, you see, right? And of course the other thing is the tourism and the arts, right? I mean that suddenly we realized that Singapore, apart from being an entrepreneur, a very important maritime entrepreneur trade, tourism is now a very big dollar spinner, right? And so they found a way to use the arts for that purpose. And therefore, arts is now very high profile. And the people who fill those jobs are all high flyers. High flyers, okay? Yes, Pokan, yes, yeah. Yep, Pokan.
That I meant to ask you, when you got all these buildings, the first one, the second one,
Yeah.
getting the building is one thing. Who maintains the building
Okay.
thereafter?
Okay. So this is where I've been criticized, okay? I took the line of least resistance, right? I was not going to get a building. I was not going to get a grant to upgrade the building. I took a building that was a going concern. This building was a school up to November 85. And in 2 months later, it became an arts center. And so we had these options. Do I become Am I the landlord and they're my tenants? Do I have an anchor tenant? Or do I bring in a kind of a third party intermediary, right? I told myself I'll take a very simple approach. You just do it yourself. You self manage it. And so the groups formed their own management committee, and they raised the funds to paint things up, and they worked out who we assigned the rooms, of course, right? So everyone didn't quarrel over the rooms, but they agreed to use a common space, the canteen, the hall for performances and so on. Yeah, but only at a fifth building, a substation, that's when we persuaded government to give us a grant. I think by then the idea was a bit more established. It became, and today, of course, arts housing is like got 40 buildings now. There are 40 buildings, and Arts Council would sort of announce that we're going to refurbish this one here or that one there, right? But in those days, I think my boss would just freak out if I asked him, but he wrote a paper to ask for money to refurbish a painting, right? And the other thing is that I made money for government. How? Okay, right, wait. So we paid the land office $24 a year to use those buildings. And I got permission to charge the groups $10 a classroom a month. So therefore, a building that I paid $24 for was earning a few $1,000s a year, for government, right? And I think on hindsight, that's why the Ministry of Finance approved my rate of $10 a classroom a month. I had to go to them for approval for that as well. So my boss was quite happy to let me allocate those rooms with Ministry of Finance's approval, right? Yeah. And then we carried on building by building by building. But today I'm afraid, that today, like this buildings have become much more priced, right? Yeah. And now there's a tendency to bring in middlemen, they invite arts entrepreneurs to develop the buildings and become the owner, the anchor tenant of that building. And then they sublet to the artists, right? I think sometimes I've heard of artist friends who would rather go to a private, a commercial building than go to an arts building, because I think the rentals are, I don't know. I don't really know for sure. Yeah. So anyway, I think we can't replicate those conditions. But arts is much more high profile now and so glamorous, and all the bankers and lawyers all want to be part of it as patrons and donors and volunteers, and it's completely different now. Yeah.
Well, with that thought, I'm going to thank you, Juliana, and call the formal session to an end. Although there's no reason why we can't continue to talk, because there is many things to discuss. So,
right.
Just take a moment to sort of thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to Stephen. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
And thank you to the University of Essex for hosting this.
Yes.